Part 1, The New Biology by Dr. Stefan Lanka. After this presentation, it will become clear how important our WIR motto is. Knowledge is relevant, not only to deal with the corona crisis constructively, but much more will be revealed. In this first part, we deal with the difficult part, namely, biology as it is not. And that may be painful, refuting genetics. But this biology lesson is a prerequisite for understanding why we falsely believe in viruses. Where does it come from? What are the concepts behind it? If we are constricted, we're forced to think in opposites, in good or evil, that something is there to harm us or even to be used for evil. You'll see it is just a false product of our history, and I'll show you this step by step. I am a biologist myself. I was a marine biologist for a long time. I came across a structure that I then interpreted as a harmless virus. Now, we know these are really mini spores. These spores have a specific function. At the time, I was a virologist, but I still believed in evil viruses. So I took it step by step and went deeper and deeper into where that idea came from originally. I concluded that they were wrong. Come with me on this journey. I also revealed my challenge back then, but after that lecture, we found that the majority of the population believe in these concepts the way we believe in terrorism, and that our own molecules can turn into terrorists within the body, which only destroy and which can even go wandering around. Whoever believes this also believes in flying metastases and gets angry at those who don't wear a mask. So let's start on this presentation. Here we see a model of a coronavirus. We could also look at any other virus model, as these are all artwork. And right away we have the first tough lesson, because none of this corresponds to actual reality. None of it. The proteins, the spikes, the bits of nucleic acid. This is a model that doesn't exist in reality, and I'm telling you, if you learn the new biology, which we get into in the second part, then you'll understand. When you know real biology, this can't possibly exist. Here's the so-called nucleic acid, the theoretical genetic strand of a theoretical virus. That is the heart of the virus. We test that hypothesis here, and the simple thing about corona is that it has never been proven to exist. Out of very short pieces of genetic strands, they calculated mathematically a whole single strand of genetic material that does not exist in reality. And if you understand where these concepts come from, why we as a culture believe in it, then we'll have real leverage. Namely, to use corona as an opportunity to address the unfortunate developments in politics and our so-called representative democracy, in our media system, etc. We have a chance to change things from the foundation because of corona. We can only change if there is a global dogma and means of communication. Without these two prerequisites, change is not possible. One country opts out, the others will fight them. But when something shakes the whole world at once, and it's clear that it's not true, then we have a chance. And we can learn from our mistakes, because if we don't learn, we are forced to repeat forevermore. So we have a big task ahead of us and only a few hours to understand where these ideas came from. Back in history, we go about 2,400 years when this person, Democritus, learned from his teacher and then expanded himself, with motivation to form the basics for our teachers today, for our understanding of life, but also of disease. So Democritus said, we need an explanation of life, an explanation of disease, but we don't want any consciousness, please. We don't want spirit in it. We don't want gods. Why? Because religion always causes fear, and that's why we need a materialistic explanation of life. He postulated that there are atoms that are immortal, and when they join together, they form molecules. Then these molecules merge again, and this somehow results in life. This purely materialistic idea of life sounded great. It was motivation to stop religious fear. But they never imagined that a new religion would emerge from it, namely a religion of good and evil, which forces us to think materialistically. Because if we want to explain something that actually exists, an illness and disease that appear simultaneously or one after the other, we are forced to believe in physical defects as reality. We have no other choice. If talking about consciousness is forbidden, we can't imagine that a word can actually kill, which it can, or that a word can heal. If thinking is forbidden, then it is naturally unthinkable that a word can become or transform flesh, for example, so-called psychosomatics. That I'll touch on in part 2. But for now, we've had a state-supported philosophy for 2,500 years where it is forbidden to think, to explore whether consciousness actually gives form or not, and can it affect your health. Languages from all nations are full of idioms that show that it can. That a fright can run through my bones and up my bones to my kidneys and liver, and so on. It shows what's going on here. It was Plato who quoted his teacher, Socrates, saying the Greek doctors can no longer deal with diseases anymore. They were just using medication to suppress symptoms in order to get slaves back to work faster. But free people would still have their souls treated with a body-soul biology, which is very exciting, which we'll talk about in the second part. And so after that, from Socrates and Plato, we go a long way forward in history to Eugene Rosenstock, who I consider the strongest and most important German thinker, at least of our time, because he predicted this whole thing in detail. He said if we research purely materially, then we end up like Greek criminal law, where we have precedents, and so everything we observe, we judge as a precedent. Then it's impossible to imagine anything new or to bring about changes with this approach. Rosenstock first published Sociology 1 in 1929, then in book form in 1956. I recommend reading a reprint the way he wanted it in 2007 by Thalheimer Publishing House. He writes here about a very important mechanism, why it is the way it is today, namely, the growth point in the scientific age lies in a new tension between research and knowledge, this fight which is still largely underestimated today. What he means by this is over here we have scientists, and way over here we have researchers. Scholars have reputations and have to be competent, and are therefore incapable of allowing subversion of their work. They are scientism bureaucrats, and they will stand together against amateurs. But research officially belongs to science, like the Holy Spirit belongs to the Church. So, we have en masse pseudoscience competing with free research. Yet only the pseudoscience alone is supported by the official bodies and foundations, because only that is worthy of their support, in their professional opinion. Side note, read Ayn Rand's Anthem to understand where this leads. Such sham research acts on the principle to have one's cake and eat it too. And now comes a sentence that has been the elephant in the room since 1929. They researched cancer according to Pasteur's outdated ideas, as if cancer was like rabies. So a double criticism here. Cancer theory is not right, plus it's based on Pasteur's infection theory, which is not right either. You have to imagine the suffering of people in an area, in a family. If I am in a family or a neighborhood all suffering and dying with the same diagnosis, it's proof that evil must exist there. They used religion according to Wellhausen's ideas, but because his research relied on old establishment authority, it was well financed. As long as scholars and researchers remained poor, real research had prospects up until 1903. when the prospects for research deteriorated because the for-profit establishment people finance science, like Corona. So that power shifts away from real research to the pseudoscience. Our Rockefeller doctor factories and grants are eloquent testimony. Unbelievably true. The next important thinker in this field is Ivan Illich. He's a philosopher who predicted corona back in 1976. In his book, The Nemesis of Medicine, he stated that if medicine is not separated from the economy, then it must provide increasing profits year after year. But where is the biology in that? What happens? They exaggerate, little by little, unnoticed, like the frog in the water that slowly comes to the boil. Illich said, there comes a point when the whole thing destroys society as a whole. He describes the exaggeration in the book, starting with vaccination, but also shows it in cases of fever, where at 43 degrees you used to give treatment, then at 40 degrees, then at 39, 38. And today, mothers are treated instead of sent away if they bring their children to the pediatrician with a 37.8 fever, because the mother is hyperventilating with fear. And this he described back in 1976, also ignored. This man, Rudolf Virchow, was the one who came up with the concept of a defective carrier gene for explaining illnesses. He is one of the most dramatic figures in our history. He was an epidemiologist during the French Revolution of 1848, which, although didn't have the desired outcome, brought about a little progress. Right after 1848, though, it got worse at first, and there was a rollback. In 1848, Virchow came up with titles. He named diseases. He was such an official. He made questionnaires for people who got sick and found if they had bed bugs, they got sick. If they breathed in vapors from feces, they get sick. If they don't have a chimney, yes, they get sick. If they have a damp fuel, etc. Give the people sewage works. Give them better social conditions and they get better and they stay healthy. He was commissioned to do this for them. He is still praised to this day. His motivation was unclear, and it is still not well known what he did 10 years later. He wanted to become a priest. His father forbade that because he himself had an expensive hobby and debts, so he discouraged Virchow, saying you really have to become famous and rich, which you can't do as a pastor. So Virchow studied medicine with the military because an uncle on his father's side was a major in the Prussian army. But state-sponsored medicine was only 20% of medicine at that time and was hated by the general public. State medicine had a bad reputation. They were responsible for organ harvesting, so he got a bad reputation. Neither poverty nor wealth came to him, so he became the leader of the reform movement. Of these military doctors like him, 80% were completely free to do whatever they wanted, wherever they wanted to practice, national or international. Nothing was regulated. Can you imagine? So he had to somehow get into the highest state office. Then he said the state had to merge with medicine. So medicine and science had to be nationalized so that humanitarian catastrophes such as typhus epidemics, cholera, etc., would be prevented in the future. The revolution was just a flash in the pan. Fortunately, nobody died, but everyone who was on the barricades was banned from practicing. But not him. He was protected and taken away from the public eye to become a full professor at the University of Würzburg. And there he comes up with a completely new theory, refuting the old humors, whereby he postulated that disease was caused by disease toxins, because one could observe that one gets sick if one takes disease toxins. Like when a teenager drinks a whole bottle of vodka. Up until 10 years ago, they would be dead unless their stomach was pumped out. We all know, well, maybe not all, but Boris Yeltsin needed 2 liters of vodka just to be able to speak in Parliament and 3 just to get on a Panzer battle tank because he had antitoxins, as in the old humors theory, where you get better if you have the antidote. That's how this defective carrier gene thing still falsely persists in medicine, of the virus theory and the antibody that is supposed to neutralize it. That is the theory that the majority of the population still believes to this day.
So,
he first fought these humorist teachers. He had many arguments published against it which were right to this day, but then later he flipped and revived the ancient humors theory in 1858, fighting famous doctors like Billroth, the surgeon whose surgical technique is still used today for kidneys, moving himself into the management position where Christian Drosten now sits, as the chairite, manipulating world politics. There he became director, stepping over people who were much more qualified because he was protected. And what did he claim in 1858? He said life consists of individual cells. That was clear. Life arises through cell division of a single cell, and all diseases can be traced back to a single cell, producing the disease poison virus and distributing it to the other cells, and it would then diffuse and the disease would spread in the whole body. He came up with this theory, and this is the crux, via an anti-clerical network, the Freemasons. His maternal uncle who helped him wasn't only a friend of the Prussian king, but was also the head of the Freemasons, and they had their own Bible, a booklet about Democritus, which was in a simple format by a Roman poet, Lucretius, from the year 200 AD, that survived the iconoclasm of Christianity and would be stolen in 1408 from a German library, and then copied and copied and copied. And from this book, Democritus's 2200-year-old atom theory was transported to the future and usurped by Virchow to make it look like Virchow invented some new idea. The smallest indivisible unit of life, the cell, although it was clear it was tissue, tissues in woven networks. So Virchow merged the cell theory into that. Later, Einstein, coincidentally another famous plagiarist and Freemason with access to the same book, also postulated atomic theory, and blah 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 came across the same thing, that the disease poison would diffuse into other cells. And Virchow had political success because he stated that there are individuals in society who are like parasites. He recommended we eradicate them from root to branch, birthing the excuse for eugenics. Once a humanitarian, he injected this theoretical cellular pathology as a scientifically founded claim into the political arena and turned everything on its head, claiming everything comes from the individual cell, so the theory of disease being caused by disease poison would then be official. Virchow hid the information they already had, specifically that disease did not spread. But after 650 years of the magnifying glass, when microscopes came along, it became clear that each organ consists of 4 different tissues. Well, back then 3 tissues were found, but we now know there are 4. So 3 different tissues which, when diseased, only one of these 3 tissues died. But this new finding was not publicized and shared correctly, but instead ignored, so this information was not spread. And that was just one example of how the humoral theory was refuted, the ancient humors theory of poison, and more poison as the antidote, with which, among others, Amadeus Mozart died and was transported into the beyond, now playing a harp in heaven. I don't know. In any case, it's clear he was in a healing crisis in which he was cramping. When we suffer a motor trauma, that's called epilepsy. And then he had a fever and so on, and back then They believed he had many illnesses, and so they drained a lot of blood, bloodletting. They drained too much blood, and that's why he's stone dead. That is the story of disease poison and the bloodletting, and that's what was set in stone. So the stage was set to grasp that the whole concept is probably not correct. And if cellular pathology is not correct, then our theory of cells is not correct, and then virus theory is implicated and not correct. Which I came across, as I said, being a biologist and becoming a marine biologist. I saw all this poison ending up in the sea, and it hit home. And I then discovered a structure of marine biology that I believed at the time was a harmless virus. Why harmless? Because these are all over the world, or maybe on one coast that produces this structure, which looks like a so-called textbook virus. The alleged viruses seen here are enlarged just as we imagine them, reproducing, and I noticed it's not going well. They're not surviving, and I was able to isolate structures from these and see the same biochemical composition every time. So I had something and saw the same protein. I repeated isolation hundreds of times, and with each time got the same nucleic acid and the same biochemistry. I had isolated something and was then able to show sufficient proof that they are always identically composed. Next, we see these particles that are supposed to be the measles virus. They are shown to us and they say these are viruses. Here we see a couple of small parts with circular appearance, spherical, but then big chunks here, and these structures presented to us as viruses have never been seen in humans, never in animals, never in liquids, in mucous membranes, in saliva, in blood, in urine, never. Everything that we are shown as viruses are false. They are just typical tissue decomposition products of the test tubes with which we work with, in which you try to, or believe you can, study life, which goes back to Virchow. He was a pathologist who believed that by looking at decayed matter of decaying tissue, he could somehow learn about life, and that's exactly what we're still doing today. We take tissue from organisms like monkey kidney tissue that lasts the longest in the test tube, at least that's what they like to say, but they really only live a bit longer because we surround them with a blood serum taken from a cow fetus in utero. Serum is blood without any solid components. If we took it from adult cows or grown mammals with no blood stem cells, the tissue would die immediately. But with fetal serum, it stays alive for a while and doesn't disintegrate so quickly. And these signs of decay in these pictures are a unique, specific in vitro test tube phenomenon that has never been seen in actual in vivo life. So quickly we move from being virus believers to an end to virology with WIR. These particles here are shown to us as viruses, but what are they really? They take broken down tissue, isolate this tissue from everything around the core that can still survive, and chunks of the tissue develop little fingers, spikes or crowns very quickly, like an amoeba that wants to rebuild the tissue again. That's why everyone who works with these cell cultures and test tubes has to constantly separate them again and again. These little chunks of tissue are misinterpreted as cells, and these little fingers with which it drags itself along to try and rebuild the tissue, these are called the villi, of which a cross-section in the electron microscope underneath is presented to us as viruses. It's that simple. It's hocus pocus zimzalabim. We see that the virologists, later we will learn why, are completely anti-scientific because they never on any level of their work do or document control experiments. For example, they could have cut through chunks at the edge or in the middle. In the middle, the diameter appears large. At the edge, it is smaller, like this. And if I am outside the chunks of tissue, then nothing would appear. And those on the edge are the only photos they are constantly presenting to us. You don't even find areas where you just have some spherical particles. If you look, the rest of the tissue is still there. You have an anti-scientific error. This pseudoscience is the basis of their actions. I can only call something scientific if it hasn't been refuted or falsified. What he means is that in science, you are supposed to set up repeatable control experiments to try and disprove and debunk your own theory as incorrect, not rig up bogus, flawed experiments to make it appear it might be true. If nobody can debunk your theory after valid scientific control experiments, your theory stands as true, or at least plausible. And you didn't do that at any level of your research, yet you paint us these models of viruses that don't really exist. So, now I see that you're astounded. How did they come to interpret particles as viruses, and why do I call myself an ex-virologist? Why? There actually are structures that exist which virologists use as their template for their so-called viruses that you can easily isolate, that you can photograph, that can be biochemically characterized, and that always have a nucleic acid in them that always has the same extended DNA strand of the same length and the same composition that we call a genetic sequence. These organisms are called phages or phages, from phagocytosis, meaning to eat up, because at first scientists believed that they eat bacteria. Today, we know if bacteria don't have time to form their proper spores from which they can quickly emerge, then they make mini-spores instead. They believed that these mini-spores were dead, because back then people believed living matter is something that has oxygen metabolism that can be measured. Today, we know that these structures propagate themselves and do have a metabolism, and I was the first one in marine biology more than 30 years ago to discover them in the sea. They actually exist and help other organisms that are not doing so well. When living conditions deteriorate, these phages supply unhealthy organisms with nucleic acid and building material. And this process is simply bacteria transforming into these phages and is not destructive. It is a metamorphosis that reproduces the entire nucleic acid of the bacteria, 100% of it. These structures are not in any way destructive. Now, of course, we know, aha! There are these structures, and they became the role model or inspiration for the virus theory model. When did it happen that they became the role model? That is crucial to understand virology. When? Why? By whom? There was an old virology before 1952, and they thought viruses came from protein pieces and that the protein had genetic material. Then the virologists did the same control experiments and determined, if we allow healthy organs to decompose first, then do the same experiment, the same filtration steps, we find the exact same proteins that we misinterpreted as viruses. So they immediately carried out control experiments along with attempts at infection and found that no transmission attempts of the so-called infection ever worked. On the contrary, they found that the experiment itself, namely extracts from sick animals injected or dripped into the lungs via a tube, caused illness. That causes the diseases. It has never been possible to transmit an extract to date from a human who was so-called infected. You can read all about that in a review published at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin on the early history of virology by Karl-Heinz Lüdtke. Back then, of course, virology was lacking a virus model. They had refuted themselves, but they established from these phage structures in 1992 that protein cannot come from protein. So protein is not genetic material. But we're forced to think that there must be a hereditary substance. That seems logical. If we believe that life comes about only through cell division of one cell and there is no consciousness, no spirit at work here, then of course we need something to make the molecules work so that from wheat seeds, wheat always emerges, or the elephant or the human, whatever. Then we're forced to acknowledge a hereditary substance that orchestrates the installation and functional plan of life. So it used to be the proteins, then it was the nucleic acid from 1952 onwards, because it was found with research that these proteins that are produced here always come with a piece of nucleic acid as a catalyst. And from 1952 onwards, the DNA hypothesis of nucleic acid being the hereditary substance emerged, and it was believed. Then these new hypothetical viruses took shape, modeled from what we call a bacteriophage, which always has a strand of genetic material inside because that is a fact. It's not surprising what happened next. A bacteriologist named John Franklin Enders, suddenly he takes up biology. He was a researcher and studied everything possible and meets a bacteriologist who worked with phages. He is fascinated, so he immediately takes up biology for his doctorate. Having never studied biology, natural sciences, or medicine, so he was never taught scientifically to check every step of his research. He used the idea that bacteriophage emerged from the tissue of animals and believed that if these tissues died too, it could transform into these viruses. We don't know what they look like, we haven't ever seen any, but if the tissues die in the test tube, that would at least hint that we have a virus, that we have an agent, and he describes what they are doing here. He used this fetal calf blood serum, he uses antibiotics, but never does a control experiment. Otherwise, he would have understood that his tissues are dying because he suddenly deprives them of the fetal calf blood serum nutrients. If he used an adult serum, they'd die too, and the antibiotics alone are already enough to kill the tissues. If Enders had done the control experiments, he would have found that the laboratory materials and technique are what kill his tissues, but instead he translated this dying tissue into the presence and isolation of a virus as the cause. So finally bringing what was outside into the lab, and we can then repeat that experiment over and over again, and that repeatability is the proof, but they are only repeating a false assumption to this day. And in this publication, which he explicitly described as speculation, he writes, "In so doing, however, we must bear in mind that these cytopathic effects, which resemble pathology, could result from a different agent that was already in the tissue or by unknown factors, because we observe that the tissue that we did nothing to also suddenly dies off." Hello? You're studying a process of something dying. Anyway, in a second attempt, an application of a second agent was tried, and the cytopathic effect changes could not be distinguished as any different from the one with the assumed infection. So obviously, the possibility of finding the same effect with other agents has to be considered. He summarizes, accordingly, the results that are summarized here must be subjected to most critical analysis. So that is what we are doing here, giving highly critical analysis. But that never happened. I'll explain right now why. He writes, there is no reason, no assumption, no justification to believe that these results in human in vivo would be the same here as in the test tube in vitro. There is no reason, he writes. We are only dealing with indirect indications, and 2 experiments are essential for the establishment of a connection between these agents that are produced here and the measles virus, namely the infection in humans and animals, that the experiment was supposed to find. Then what happens? John Franklin Enders, 6 months later out of the blue on the 1st of June 1954, for a completely different thing, got a Nobel Prize for medicine. And what came out of this explicit speculation? The foundation for modern medicine arose like a phoenix from the ashes, and the ongoing fight from virologists against the old virus model was lost, as they just made a new one that is unquestionably linked with a pseudoscience technique that has never been controlled. So I controlled their measles virus experiment. Namely, stop the bovine serum nutrient feeding and the poisonous antibiotics, which kill the bacteria that are everywhere and that cause the cell death like clockwork, which then the biologists pass off as a supposed infection as the cells die off, and they say, hey, that's the virus, and based on this false conclusion, production is carried out of this rotting soup for live vaccines. They say the whole infectious virus is still living in the substance. For dead vaccines, only a part of the alleged virus, so just a protein, and more recently mRNA, that we call inactivated virus. My control experiment was just doing the exact same procedure, except with no infection, and the tissue dies in the exact same way. Then what does the virologist do? The virologist takes nucleic acid, just little bits and sections, please. He's never seen the whole strand or sequence, like we do with phage, which we have been isolating and characterizing the entire nucleic acid sequence from for 70 years now. We show we always have the same sequence. But the virologist instead constructs something that he calls the virus ABC. And that shows us that this publication is quite clearly taking an anti-scientific turn, and now proves that virology has refuted and debunked itself. They describe step by step that they isolated nothing, that they haven't found anything, and that they had to multiply it a little and then mathematically construct something which you never find in reality. And also, these control experiments, as I've done with measles virus and now with coronavirus, are available now, and I'm curious who will be the one to publish them first, because they'll be holding the trump card. So we do control experiments with nucleic acid from humans, animals, whatever. We do exactly the same thing as the virologists do, and lo and behold, we can construct the exact same genome if we tell the computer program what to make out of the same small fragment pieces. Now coronavirus from the same data, now make the HIV virus. Or here, make Ebola. Or influenza.
You get what you pay for.
And now, I'm going to show you the refutation of genetics itself. This knowledge is from June 12, 2008, The Genome in Dissolution. Download this from the internet before it is censored. Yes, get it. This is the refutation of genetics and thus virology, because the geneticists did not tell the virologists that they had refuted themselves. Now they say, oh, we are doing epigenetics, so we need more money for 40 years, and then we'll know more about heredity. This report is about a conference that took place in 2006. The genome was then considered an unchangeable blueprint of humans. That's what we believe, that it's fixed at the beginning of our lives. We take this from mom, this from dad, and then our combination is set. Science has to say goodbye to this idea. In reality, our genetic makeup is in constant flux, changing, and I guess our legacy is constantly changing. Just like as a pure gold Krugerrand coin becomes a green printed paper certificate and becomes worthless overnight, who would take that on? So in 2006, 25 geneticists sat down at the University of California at Berkeley to answer the simple question, what is a gene? In an attempt to precisely define the basis of their field. However, defining a gene turned out to be extremely difficult. The expert meeting almost ended in disaster, remembers Karen Eilbeck, professor of human genetics at Berkeley, now Utah, and the host of the panel. You can search for the entire original document via her name on the internet about it all. We had sessions that lasted for hours. Everyone shouted at everyone else, she said. And exactly the same thing happens when the virologists are confronted with their own deeds. But they don't just yell at each other, though. I'm quite sure that if Christian Drozdon were there, they'd say, "You idiot, why must you exaggerate so much? Now they'll be watching us." So why? The dispute in Berkeley had little to do with the experts' vanity. It was really a first symptom that life sciences were dying, unnoticed by the public, facing a brick wall, unnoticed by the public. That was 2008. So what did we learn? The scientists have disproved themselves, but still today the public believes in gene tests, paternity tests, blah, 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 and so on. In reality, these researchers talk about the chromosome strings of humans or animals, and bringing it to light shatters the previous held ideas about genetics. Medical research is facing new challenges, the first outlines of which go back to body and soul. Ha! Suddenly the soul is back. Yes, health, illness, development, and aging are subject to a genetic interplay whose complexity exceeds all previous ideas. And here comes the crux of the matter. The geneticists have to say goodbye to their image of a stable, unchanging genome in which changes are considered pathological exceptions. So thinking wider, we get the idea that there must be a hereditary substance that forces us into materialistic thinking, propped up by cellular pathology and cell theory of life. Thinking there must be a hereditary substance, so the same thing always comes out of the same thing and is of course unchangeable, and that's all. For now, we're sitting again in the cave with Plato. You see shadows, we see it described and interpret it, and you dare not turn like him to see where the light is coming from, and who in your audience makes the most noise. This is our situation. Why? The genome of everyone is constantly remodeling. Every organism, every human being, every body cell is a genetic universe in itself. Boom. And that's exactly what virologists do today. They look for little fragments, read them, and then build a theoretical strand of genetic material, just as geneticists build a chromosome. And we didn't hold them to account. We just let it be. But no, they continued too big to fail. When even the geneticists didn't tell the public the truth back in 2008, we are now in 2022, that they'd completely disproven themselves, we can't expect that now from the virologists either. We can't wait for them and maybe not, but that's a very important point here. It's our culture, so we should really approach these people carefully, because it's almost impossible for them to give up their own models. Because it's their whole identity, their family, livelihood, and so on, and now that's all supposed to be wrong, and in this case, even dangerous. So everything changes, every core of the idea. We have completely refuted their genetic material. So, let's see how Corona started. The Chinese tried to calm the wave of panic that broke out at the end of 2019, and Professor Christian Drosten didn't get drunk at New Year's Eve like everyone else, but instead went on the internet, looked at the sequences from the hospital, and thought it's a kind of a SARS virus. He took the sequences attributed to the coronavirus and prepared 3 very different test procedures. So Drosten synthesized the chemical sequence. That alone normally takes 5 days. Yet on the same day the authors of this study posted their sequence. The quote is here at the bottom in Nature magazine on the 10th of January. Using the sequences that he calculated from the internet, Christian Drosten sent his test chemicals all over the world. The Chinese government said, look here, we have a sudden emerging respiratory syndrome, SARS, but all 49 cases of pneumonia in the greater Wuhan area were all isolated. All friends, all neighbors, all work colleagues, everyone that they had already been in contact with were all quarantined, and none of them got sick. So this was not SARS. They communicated openly and honestly to the WHO and to everyone saying it's okay, we're handling it. It's extremely difficult to transmit, and we've closed the fish markets and the world markets, and we're not getting new infections, so we can have our New Year's celebration on the 25th January 2020, the Communist Party planned event. Yes, half of China will take to the streets. But what happened? A friend of Drosten's, a doctor, travels on his own initiative from southern China to Wuhan, holds a press conference at noon, all the Western media are somehow already waiting there, and says that the Chinese government is lying. Imagine that. Usually they would be made into fish meal or end up in an insane asylum if they said the government lies about viruses, or they'd say that Karl Lauterbach is wrong. All this in a dictatorship we can't even imagine. They have 1 million Falun Gong holistic Qi medicine practitioners in concentration camps. 100 children die every day in these camps. It's no funfair there. Then, of course, a huge panic breaks out because this doctor says they lied, and look, I have 2 patients from southern China who weren't in Wuhan that tested positive for the virus using the test just whipped up from Dr. Drosten. So the panic took off. They can't get this under control anymore. And reading from Fang Fang's Wuhan diary, they brought the panic under control, with military on the streets, ordered to shoot anyone who comes out of their house. Everyone in the streets who couldn't find their family or they made the wrong choice were stuck. They weren't allowed out for months, and garbage trucks had to throw the food at their doors. They don't have time to pack for an 11 million population. And that's how Christian Drosten turned a local panic into a global one. And that's his business model. And that's what he always did with SARS, with Zika. What else did we have in the Congo? They had Ebola. So there we have it, everywhere now. He did it before with influenza viruses. And yes, bird, pig, fish, frog flu. We always hear the same thing. Christian Drosten gives his sequence for the PCR test to the world for free of charge for humanitarian reasons, which gives positive results and gives the impression there's something spreading. For those who believe. And this is the publication we're reading from now, step by step. Now I have a mathematician who really knows his stuff and has a very responsible job, but he is also a responsible father, so he doesn't want to show himself yet. He analyzed this work step by step to be published soon, showing all of the contradictions, the self-refutation of the virologists on every level. It shows that only with a computer program that the Chinese made themselves could a genome of this length, which could correspond to the coronavirus, be generated. If you try another program, sometimes it doesn't work at all. So sometimes the program looks for bits of overlaps of individual letters, and then it builds something whole that's called assembly. Yeah, assembly. And in one program it works, while in the other it doesn't. Later, bioinformaticians wrote, hey, with all other 49 computer programs that virologists use, it doesn't work either. He shows you step by step. This is the raw data, and there are these gaps that they fill in with dirty PCR sequences. If I set the PCR to be dirty, then over 14 duplication cycles it will be positive. Then 30 cycles are completely dirty, and 45 cycles are just completely unscientific. Because theoretically, the PCR can no longer function with all these gaps in the sequences. To construct the whole genome, they must mathematically fill it with a second very dirty PCR, and also many details reported to refute the whole thing. And we have shown that there are many sequences that are just typical human sequences, and that tallies with the control experiment we commissioned at an elite university. They wish to remain anonymous, but the data is there, it's published. In it we show with a clean 14-cycle PCR we already find human RNA. We already get 98.5% of the alleged virus genome range, while after their first step, they only got 10%. So how do we approach the topic? Let's go to our basic rights, which are secured by the Declaration of Human Rights, which precede every constitution, as a tool with which we can get things under control, and how we as humanity collectively can learn from this, and then with a deeper understanding of biology, of our biology, to finally leave this dualism, this good-bad thinking behind us. That's why I do this work, because we have a great chance to make a leap in human development based on human rights. Human dignity is inviolable. The German people, all people, must commit to inviolable and inalienable human rights as the basis of every human community of peace and justice. And here, it is important to present another book by Tom Holland, Dominion. He shows that the principle of human rights, individual freedom, individual responsibility, freedom of conscience, equality, are all Christian values that go back to Jesus Christ, but just not called that since the French Revolution. But that's also very important because I see an impulse going on here, an absolutely constructive impulse. It's our task to take it on and implement it. The following basic rights bind legislation as directly applicable law, and everyone here knows that there is a massive interference with freedom of personal development. We can't do certain jobs. I'm not allowed to go anywhere, and so on. There is, of course, also this right to life and physical integrity, which is being attacked. By the infection protection law, we must be vaccinated or we risk isolation. Vaccination? Some will die, yes, but that is our service to the community so that we can all live. It simply has to be so, vaccine damage and all. That's your service to the community using the Infection Protection Act to enforce it. But it does not interfere with our right to freedom of conscience, political views, or religious belief. That is not in the Infection Protection Act. So if I plead a belief in a God who made me without an injection in the ass, and I believe in a God who doesn't throw viruses at unsuspecting babies, then I'm out. Completely out. It's my belief. When minarets stand here to enforce their belief, then I can say I believe in a God who made me perfect. at least to the extent that my so-called immune system doesn't need a booster. In the USA, people are being acquitted, and people who fired them now have to pay fines because they exercised their faith. So this is a tool, but it gets better. It gets easier. Article 5. Freedom of expression. Censorship should not take place, but it certainly is. Politicians commissioned this after lessons learned from the Federal Health Journal in December 2010 called Pandemic Lessons Learned. Lessons like why suddenly 93% of the population rejected the swine flu vaccination at the time because they figured out there are nanoparticles in them. Today, critics are screaming about spike proteins, RNA, etc., making sure no one knows that the dangerous nanoparticles are also in there this time. Those caused the vaccination damage. Because they learned from the swine flu. They said, okay, the swine flu was gone from the media overnight, and they saw there were too many conflicting specialists, so in the future, only one opinion may be presented, and we can't let misinformation run riot on the internet, because that led to the 93% of the population believing them and refusing vaccination, and that is an important detail, so they started censoring. But they forgot to put the censorship clause in their infection protection law, so they are all anti-constitutional, one and all, anti-constitutional. For this reason, they have contravened faith and freedom of conscience. In my political view, yes, censorship should not take place, and the freedom of the press takes a back seat because they've been ordered to, and because they are also anti-scientific. Everyone going along with Corona has proven they are anti-scientific because the law states that art, science, research, and teaching are independent. But that independence does not absolve you from loyalty to the Constitution. That means I am again bound to the truth by inalienable rights, and that therefore requires the greatest care in science, and it isn't there. Here, we now have the infection protection law, and paragraph 1, part 2 is the cracker, because it says you have to be scientific. In law, we have can, meaning if you feel like it, do it. Or we have shall, you must do it. Can or shall. Shall or must be supported according to the current status of the works of medical epidemiological science and technology, i.e., the infection protection law prescribes science which is false, meaning the infection protection law loses its validity from the moment they know the true facts. And of course, for the public, we are working on that here today, for which I am very grateful. They have lost their validity, and all corona measures that are based on the infection protection law are illegal from the start. Paragraph 2 regulates here the pathogen, yes, that is the virus defined, yes, an agent, yes, you know, like Agent 007, only blonde women can isolate him. An agent is clearly there by the order of the Queen, but it doesn't say in there an idea or equation. It also mentions vaccine damage as a fact. So this is how virology has now been shown to be anti-scientific by more and more people, because this memorandum that came out in 1997 exposes a huge international research fraud that went public in Germany first. Everyone in genetics, biology, vaccination, AIDS, cancer, everyone you can imagine, all were co-authors on a publication by Friedheim Hermann. You can read it on Wikipedia, and wonderful that it's still on there. He invented almost all his data, and a whistleblower went public with it, and that's how this scandal broke out. And a lot of politicians, public prosecutors, and so on said, That's enough. Now we need a paragraph of scientific fraud, and this stunt has cost us $300 million in research funds. The science they deleted from was about high-dose chemotherapy in women, but the chemotherapy remained, and they said that's the end of it now. Let's build a paragraph on scientific fraud. And then came the DFG, the German Research Association, which distributes billions in research funds. Remember what Rosenstock said back in 1929. The grateful people fund science extensively, and this has been going on for a long time. So I get angry when they call this corona a plandemic. No, it's not. It's an inevitable outcome from Ivan Illich to now, culminating in a quasi-Third World War, but a soft war. A war that's caused so little human damage, at least directly. So it's kind of a hello wake-up call with a good spirit. Now we get to the point, namely virology. Virus, yes or no? Science, yes or no? They said, oh, no, no, no. Only scientists can assess who is scientific. No politician can, no one else, only we scientists can. And what do you want? Because there are so few bad apples among the good ones. So let's please write down the rules that we've always observed as part of the employment contract so that politicians couldn't be reeled back in. The set of rules agree that the scientific work is based on a fundamental principle that are the same in all countries and scientific disciplines. Good scientific practice, blah, 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 important for us right now. It's the task of the scientist to consistently check and doubt results. Why? Because in the history of mankind, no proven theory exists so far, not a single one. Everything had to be revised, and if there are still one or two theories that persist, then they have been changed in such a way that what they once believed is gone, and that is the point. To err is human, but to not admit the error is fatal, and for that we have rules. For that we task every scientist to constantly doubt everything. Also, other findings must be presented. The results and hypotheses are to be questioned, so they are forced into my position. As a virus discoverer, virologist, I can say that. Virus discoverer, I have such a structure, yes, a doctorate in biology, which is what I graduated in. Biologist, yes, they must publish it, but they don't. It's clearly because from Eugene Rosenstock, scholars are competent and they don't like to overturn what they did, so we have to do the work. Here, the sentence. Control experiments with just as complete disclosure of the experimental setup are a central component of scientific methodology to verify applied methods and exclude disruptive factors. And they never did that. In the entire history of virology, there was no documentation of control experiments at any level of their work. And that is why they are anti-scientific. That is why the infection protection law violates rights and all measures are illegal. Carry that forth. Use this in future complaints and court proceedings, and please make sure you only present this point, not a second or third one. I used to do that a lot. It helps a lot, yeah? No. You jump from one point to the other too much, said the judge in Los Angeles. Are you scientific or not? And there can be no virologist who comes along and says we are the unscientific ones because there is no publication with documented control experiments. None. End of story. At the same time, we have the beginning of a leap in human development where we can learn from everyone and are no longer forced to repeat all of this nonsense, AIDS, cancer, and so on. And that's what part 2 of this lecture is all about. What is real biology? I would like to thank everyone who made this possible. See you next time.